Thank you very much for sharing your thoughts. Actually, some of the questions I had you just took away, but we'll try to ad-lib as well. I would like to introduce the two gentlemen that joined us. First one here on my right is Rich Baich. He's the CISO of Wells Fargo, and he allowed me actually to read his bio, so I will. So Rich is the CISO of Wells Fargo. Prior to joining, he was a principal at Deloitte, where he led the global cyber threat. And he's also a retired Naval Information Warfare officer. And after 9/11, he was helping the NIPC at the FBI. He's also the author of award-winning book, Winning as a CISO, which in my mind is an oxymoron, but never mind. And welcome, Rich, and thank you for joining us. Please. Also with me is Nadav Zafrir, whom some of you heard yesterday. He's the co-founder and CEO of Team 8, and before that he was head of IDF's Technology and Intelligence Unit, 8200, as well as founder of the IDF Cyber Command, and today he's also my boss, so I'll be nice to him. Welcome, Nadav. So, gentlemen, actually Bruce was talking about a lot of the damaging information that came out in this Sony event. There were atypical things like emails, salaries, gossip, bad Obama jokes. Actually, we had our own bad Obama joke here in Israel, but we won't talk about that. So if everything is potentially damaging, how can companies and CIOs and CISOs identify their crown jewels and actually protect them? Maybe, Rich, you want to take us off?
So, I mean, it's an interesting question because, in general, you can't necessarily spend the amount of money that's required to protect everything at the highest level. So, from an organizational standpoint, trying to prioritize your assets is a function most organizations do, and then around those assets you may choose different deployments of defensive measures to protect them. And I'd say it's probably wasn't the individual elements that caused the damage, it's the fusion of the data to help tell the story and the consequences. So I think the example that you use is more about consequential management rather than just the theft of individual data.
Thank you. Nadav?
I think there's no generic answer. I think it has to do with the context of your specific organization, the specific organization that you're running. Basically, I agree with Rich. I mean, if you protect everything, then you're basically protecting nothing. If you don't know what you're protecting and who you're protecting against, then like Alice in Wonderland, it doesn't really matter how you protect. So basically, I think what organizations have to do is identify what their specific crown jewels are in what context versus which adversary, and only then you can narrow it down to a small percentage of your data, of your infrastructure, of your personnel. And it's a hard job.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm actually a little more optimistic. This might be the first real backstop against companies being sociopathic, because it turns out these aren't the crown jewels. These are just conversations. And it turns out a lot of companies do and say things that they really wish they didn't. You know, one of the things leaked in the Sony documents, we saw the Sony executive salaries. We also actually saw the Deloitte executive salaries, because an employee of Deloitte went to Sony and took a copy with her, and it ended up in the trove, and it ended up with the hackers, and ended up being released. So here it's someone that it wasn't even Deloitte's fault, and their executive salaries are being released. I mean, the security measure here is, right, don't pay salaries you'll be embarrassed to see in public. Right? Don't send emails you'd be embarrassed to see in public. But I actually think that's important. I mean, in general, I mean, look what's happening right now with Saudi Arabia. I mean, a lot of their diplomatic stuff is being leaked on WikiLeaks, and it's stuff they kind of wish they didn't do, or at least wish that the world didn't know they did. You know, the solution in a world where secrets are harder to keep is, you know, do things that when they're exposed, you're not going to wish weren't exposed. It's a lousy solution. But I think organizationally, we're going to have to look at assuming that we're going to just be more visible.
Bruce, you talked before about actually Sony's image, which is not stellar to say the least. But let me take you to a scenario where this kind of public outing and public shaming comes out to an institution that people would like to trust. For example, a financial institution like a bank. What do you say about that?
I mean, this is the problem, and we're really seeing this more play out in the personal space, not in the corporate space, as individuals have their information published. And there's a term for it, doxing, and it is being used as a tool, and as a tool of power. And we're also seeing it in this in the public shaming of individuals who say things that are unpopular. And how we as society deal with that is still very much in flux. And I think we're now seeing companies being pulled into that, as this kind of public release, forcible public releasing is a way for the less powerful to get more power. And when you saw H.B. Gary got that from LulzSec, they got it because they were being jerks to hackers, and hackers wanted to get even, and this is the way they could do it. I mean, we don't know the motive in the Saudi Arabia case, but my guess is it is some kind of political, I'm going to get even at the government motive by somebody who wanted that. So, I mean, I don't know where the answer is, but this is actually a very big question right now in this decade.
So, Rich, let's think something like this happens, of course not to Wells Fargo because you're the CISO, but to one of your competitors. After you finish gloating, what do you do then?
Well, maybe we should ask you. Weren't you the CIO of a bank here in Israel?
Yes, I was, but former. So now I don't have any of these concerns. I can sit here and grill you.
This will be the hacker smackdown tonight, these two banks against each other.
So, you know, I think it doesn't matter. This is really about reputational management, and you know, the reality of it is this information security and cybersecurity consequence is what drives you know, a lot of the different behaviors, and it's really about how you handle the incident rather than the incident occurring, because you know, the reality of it is the ability to have a information security incident is, as you can see, read any newspapers, is happening everywhere. But how an organization uses it, responds to it, the facts associated with it. I mean, if you look at many of the cases that have been in the news media and how organizations are dealing with it, you know, that's what drives customer confidence. I think in today's environment, individuals understand the fact that organizations are doing their best to protect their information, and oftentimes, you know, can fall victim, you know, to a potential, let's just say, nation-state threat. When an organization, unfortunately, falls victim and maybe didn't take appropriate action or have sufficient controls, you know, there could be a backlash, you know, from their customers. So the whole, I think, answer to this is how do you deal with an incident and the consequential management of the incident itself.
Nadav, I'd like actually you to kick off with a different question. In Sony, it's believed, and actually Bruce referred to it, that the attack took a very long time, and they moved in the Sony network for months, actually, before the network went down and the attack went public. But the damage continued a lot after the attack ended. Even this week, we saw more. And assuming Sony had no way of actually stopping this attack, what would the CEO need to know in order to effectively respond to an attack of this nature?
Look, I think specifically in Sony's case, it was almost impossible for the CEO to do much better than he did. Because like Bruce said before, he was not prepared for this. And so I think once you're hit, that's probably not the best time to start preparing for it or training for it. So I think the question has to be asked ex ante, what could be done before something like this hits the organizations, and I think there is a lot to be done. By the way, I think there's a, there's a learning curve between attackers and defenders, between offense and defense, and we're obviously behind in the learning curve in terms of defense. And it might get worse before it gets better, but it will get better because just like it's been in other domains, offense is emerging now, and defense will catch up eventually. And I want to say, by the way, sort of take it to a bit of another course, but this is a cyber conference, and we're talking about the consequences of cyber in the 21st century. Let's not forget, it's not as if we came from another century where there wasn't cyber, but there were some other ways to hurt people or kill people and stuff like that. So this is just another mean to achieve the same goals, and the learning curve for the defense will come back.
Yeah, I see two things. I mean, certainly Sony, I think, should have had a better response, and that's going to be not drilling the actual incident, but some kind of response, training and drilling and practice, so people know each other, know what to do, have communication systems that are not using the network under attack. There's a lot that could be done in response to make that better. The other thing that's interesting is this is a place where a company uses its reputation capital. I mean, Sony was a company that no one trusted, and so it made it worse. I mean, compare that to what happened to Apple last summer with the leaking of the celebrity photos. I mean, a very embarrassing thing for Apple. But they managed to weather it a lot better because they are inherently a more trusted company. So they're going to be taken more at face value. They're responsible to be trusted. There'll be more belief that they did their best and it just failed, as opposed to Sony, where everyone thinks they didn't care and it just happened. So it's really interesting to see. It really shows who you are as a company. And you invest in this capital that you're going to spend like mad during this attack. But if you have enough, you'll be able to come out the other end well as opposed to poorly.
Rich, before I ask you to answer the same question, yesterday we spoke and you told me about the change that happened in Wells Fargo regarding where the position of the CISO is. So if you could also tie that into your response, because what happens, if you could explain what Wells Fargo did and how that could potentially change the response of a bank in such an attack.
Sure. So I think great points. It really comes down to, again, how you handle an incident. And in today's environment, an incident actually is as much a corporate event as it is a cyber event, because you're going to have your legal team involved, you're going to have your crisis communication team involved, you're going to be liaisoning with law enforcement and potential national security. You're going to be looking at forensics. You could be engaging your fraud teams. You're obviously going to be engaging with your IT infrastructure teams. All of those come together in a time of crisis, and what to do. And if you're not practicing that, and that's the first time coming out the gate, there are learning curves. I'd say from a leading practice standpoint, organizations are probably doing at a minimum tabletops quarterly around incidents and actually coming up with real live incidents. And in addition to that, sophisticated organizations, they have their own, red teams where they're testing their own systems, validating and trying to see if they could break in themselves and cause their own alarms and controls within their own organization. The art of information security is about trust but verify. And part of what a good information security and cybersecurity team does is they're actually testing their own controls. And part of those controls are how you deal with an incident. So those are some of the attributes. And then the particular field of, if we talk about information security for a minute and you think about this new term, which is now cybersecurity, what's the difference? From my viewpoint, information security has been around for a very long time, very much a siloed, disciplined domain construct. And what cybersecurity has done here in the last several years is really take that practice and operationalize it and try to drive it so that it's being proactive and preemptive. And then as a result of that, there's no such thing as a sturdy defense. It's really around risk management. So from a corporate standpoint, you're going to see organizations move a lot of their information and cybersecurity functionality out from a traditional IT infrastructure and move over to maybe the risk office or the operations office, because you want to have that segregation of duties between traditional IT practices. Good information security practices and cyber practices have a huge dependency on technology and the technology teams adhering and maintaining their infrastructure to a higher level, good defense, as well as obviously the Security Operations Center, and many of those being merged into cyber threat fusion centers, where you can kind of say it's not the offense of the company, but it's the ability to be proactive and preemptive through analysis, whether that be open source, through partnerships and engagements with law enforcement and national security. So, the emergence of going into cybersecurity and the emergence of the reporting structure moving out from, let's just say, the CIO, I think is something you're going to see from an industry change here in the next few years.
Thank you. I'd like to actually kick off the last question, referring, Bruce, to what you said about who should have defended Sony. We are used to the fact that if we're attacked by a nation, then we have our own nation, our own military, etc., defend us. But here we have a type of asymmetrical warfare, and I think this was mentioned a few times during the past 2 days. So in this world, how can any enterprise, corporation, prepare, defend? What should we do? Basically, as enterprises, we're focused on businesses, doing our business, selling more, making more revenues, etc. Suddenly, we're under war. We have to, buy helmets? What do we do? Bruce?
Security has always been a combination of protection, detection, and response. And I think as an industry, we've matured over the decades. And we spent the 90s selling firewalls and antivirus, the idea that we're just going to build these barriers to keep the bad guys out. In 2000s, you started seeing detection systems, trying to detect attacks as they happen, IDSs and other advanced things. And in this decade, I think we're finally seeing response come into his own. And we're seeing products and services built around responding. And what Rich said is really right, that response very quickly moves from technical to political. That for the first hour, it's the IT team, but very quickly you need the lawyers, you need HR, you need PR, you need all of these different departments. And coordinating that is a huge thing. And personally, I'm now building a company to do coordination for incident response, because this is an area I think is really vital. And we need to get to the point where we know we're not going to prevent attacks, but we can survive them, that we have some kind of resilience in our system. And it's going to be different things. Apple Pay is a really great example of turning a credit card system, which is very vulnerable for those big databases of credit cards that the retailers keep, to a one-time number system where that database becomes less valuable. Right? That is a resilience measure that makes this cybercrime less effective, right, by some creative thinking. And I think we're going to see more of that kind of thinking in corporate networks. Maybe we won't be able to prevent this attack, but this massive attack of all of our information being public, we're going to have less information that needs to be secret. We're going to be more open as a company. We're going to have this reputational capital we can spend, and we'll be more resilient against this sort of attack. So I think we now are going to start looking at the whole, finally, and coming up with strategies that let us survive, right? The NSA is surviving Snowden. Saudi Arabia is going to survive their leaker. We all seem to manage. We just want to make it less painful.
So Rich, before you answer, does the bank now, as one of its goals, say, I need to defend myself? I need to be able to defend myself against...
See, if they had less money, it'd be easy.
Against a rogue nation state?
So from a financial services industry standpoint, specifically to the United States, the strength in numbers. So we have a governing body which helps policy with the government called the FISIC. And then we have a tactical operational body called the Financial Services Information Sharing Analysis Center. And those things are put together because the reality of it is no financial institution normally is the only one experiencing a potential attack, exploit, or whatever it may be. And by sharing that information, the financial institutions obviously can potentially, respond in a particularly coordinated way to understand when a particular, attack is being launched, let's just say, across the industry. That also has tiebacks into the government to set the stage as far as the ability to get the proper information sharing out to the right individuals so that the appropriate actions can take. So speed is critical, and to piggyback on what Bruce said is today, I think the effective organization is the one who can demonstrate the shortest lapse time between identifying an incident and being able to isolate, retain it, detect it, and then how you respond to it. So lapse time, I think, is a term we're going to hear a lot more about.
Nadav, as one of the top experts on asymmetrical warfare, here's me sucking up to my boss. What can you say about the situation?
Look, I think, first of all, I think CEOs and top C-level managers of larger organizations are going to have to start thinking like leaders of small nations. By the way, in the 21st century, some of these corporations have more impact on everybody's lives than the national leaders of their nation states have anyways. And so I don't think it should be a surprise for these leaders or these CEOs and their C-level and the boardroom that they now have to deal in a globalized asymmetric warfare situation with the strategic planning just like leaders of nations had to do in the 20th century. And it is changing the world, but it's not impossible to get a decent cyber posture for an organization if you know what you're defending, who you're defending against, and you prioritize and segment the things that are really important. And like Bruce said, if the norm used to be in the past that mostly everything is private and very little that you choose becomes public, vice versa. So mostly everything is public. Our generation, it's something that is difficult for us to comprehend, but the next generations are going to, born into this reality, and there's going to be very little that remains private, and that very little, and it might be a specific transaction for some kind of firm. It might be a specific vertical at a specific time of the year, at a specific geography that is super crucial, and on that you're going to put substantial resources to protect that. And then, like Rich said, the next step is that organizations, just like nation states and militaries have done in the past, are going to have to prepare for an incident becoming an event. And that's going to happen every once in a while. If it doesn't happen very often, well, that's a good thing. When it does happen, if you can shorten the time to bounce back, that's good again. And the last thing that I want to say about that is that I think you're going to see organizations, just like Bruce said about reputational assets, you're going to see organizations leverage their ability to thrive in the cyber age. That means that this is not just going to be a threat, but also a competitive advantage. I mean, I'm going to say that I'm leading the bank or the law firm or the e-trader that has the best security measures for my customers, and that's going to be one of the things that I sell to my customers. So the whole notion of cyber is not just about the threat, it's obviously also an opportunity, not only for cyber vendors, but also for everybody on Earth, and it's going to become everybody's problem.
Yeah, I kind of both like and dislike the notion that companies have to sort of become their own nation states. I mean, I think you're right, companies have to defend themselves, but we really don't want to repeat like the Dutch East India Company, the United Fruit Company, where we have companies with private armies. So we have to think about attack versus defense there and how that works. I think that actually is going to be interesting as some companies realize that they cannot rely on their governments to defend them. And we're seeing more calls for what's being called strike back. Companies want to attack back. And I worry about that. I mean, I think there's the real reason why we don't allow private entities to have sanctioned violence. So I think it's a really interesting policy discussion.
Yeah, I think it's going to be a collaboration between nation states, between nation states, corporations, between corporations, and between them. And somebody said last year, I think it was Keith Alexander, that cyber is a team sport. So obviously we don't expect companies to take action, violent actions, but we do expect them to be very well able to protect themselves.
Gentlemen, I want to thank you very much for your thoughts, sharing them with the audience. Thank you very much.
Thank you.